Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our keynote speaker. This morning, we will be hearing from Shari Davis, the co-executive director of the Participatory Budgeting Project. I'm so pleased to welcome Shari. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. I'd like to give a brief overview of your bio, but I know that you're going to have so much more to contribute, so thank you. So Shari Davis is the co-executive director of the Participatory Budgeting Project and joined PBP staff after nearly 15 years of leadership in local government. They bring years of government, youth engagement, and public health experience to leadership focused on authentic engagement and building support around community-led processes. Shari is a graduate of Boston University Sargent College for Health and Rehabilitation Sciences and holds a master's degree in anatomy and physiology, because those connect, right? I'm interested in how that evolved, right? Shari previously worked as a director of youth engagement and employment for the city of Boston, through which they launched Youth Lead the Change, the first youth participatory budgeting process in the U.S., which won the U.S. Conference of Mayors City Livability Award. Shari is passionate about building spaces for leaders of all backgrounds to lead with real community power. They are a 2019 Obama Fellow, and in 2020, Shari gave a TED Talk about participatory budgeting and the power of radical collective imagination. I would highly recommend that if you've not seen it already. Welcome, Shari.
Thank you so much. And I'm so excited to be here with you all in this virtual room. I think the plan is that I'm going to share a little bit about participatory budgeting, invite you all into some conversation, ask you all to think about some things, and then see what questions you all have for us to sit with and answer together. Before I get started, I did just want to mention that anatomy and physiology and deep civic engagement are absolutely related. I get this kind of question a lot when people talk about my bio or background. And yes, I studied science. My background is in science. And I think the best parts of that is it taught me how to think. It taught me how to think with a person at the center. And it taught me how to understand that it's all connected. Not only is your practice and network connected, but every chain in your body is connected to something else. And so it really allowed me to kind of understand what those connection points are. And if someone could give me screen sharing ability, I will share my screen in just a moment. And as we get going, again, y'all, my name is Shari Davis. I serve as the co-executive director at the Participatory Budgeting Project. And we're going to talk about radical imagination with the participatory budgeting process. And it's really going to be an opportunity for you all to put yourselves in the center and think about how you're connected to this bigger picture of this work and what the opportunities of this work are. So I hope that everyone is able to see my screen now. And if you want to take a screenshot of a slide, this is a good one because it has my contact information in it. It also has PBP's website in case you want more information at the end of this presentation. And so sometimes I tell people to get lively in the chat. This is an invitation to all of you all out there listening or on the YouTube stream. Tell me a little bit about you, why you're here, what you're hoping to get out of this session as we open up some space for some radical imagination and thinking about whole people, how they connect to bigger and broader systems, and how we change the bigger and broader system by really recognizing the power that people have. As we get going too, I just want to kind of name where I'm coming from. Yes, I'm calling in from the Bay Area today, but our organization is the Participatory Budgeting Project. I mentioned I'm co-executive director. I lead with two other amazing Black leaders at PBP. We were founded in 2009. That's when you saw some of the first instances of participatory budgeting in the United States. So we're something like 10 years new. And our mission is really to allow people to decide together how to spend public money. We work across the United States. And I mentioned I live in the Bay Area in Oakland, but we also have an office in New York. And I think we're at a point now where today we're going to talk a lot about budgeting. But we're at a point now where our organization and our partners across the country are really thinking about what it means to reimagine democracy on a variety of levels. And as we move into our presentation today, some of you all might be typing into the chat who you are and why you're here. That's great. And I want everyone to think about this question. Where are the places where you find community, where you find your community? I think so often when we have conversations like this, we talk about community in big, broad ways, but I think it's actually really important to get specific about the community that we're talking about or could be talking about, or that is important to you if you're out there listening. Often when I answer this question, when I think about the places where I find my community, it's certainly in LGBTQIA spaces. It's spaces with artists and music. When I think about my community, it's often folks that are in a low income bracket, Black and brown folks. I think about my community, my family that's formerly or currently incarcerated. I think about my community that loves joy. I think about my community that is, I mentioned artistic, but creative beyond what I think we know is possible. When I think about my community, it's often Black people of color. When I think about the communities that I'm a part of, I think about Native American folks. I think about Indigenous people. I think about, I hope you all are thinking about where you find your community. Where are the places where they exist? Who are they? And I think it's so important to get specific about who those people are. When we talk about deep civic engagement on big and small levels, understanding who we're talking about, I think is one of the first steps. Now, as we move to where we find these people and we're continuing to think about who the people in community are, I often invite folks to think about, well, what languages do they speak? How do they come together? And in this moment, you may choose to draw them. I ask people to do that because it forces folks to think through some descriptors, some of that opportunity to get more and more specific. And I love asking this sort of question because when we ask what languages do they speak, not only where are they, but who are the members of your community, it allows us to almost start understanding what an outreach plan is, who the people that need to be at the center are, and it gets a lot less vague. And so when I do participatory budgeting in communities like Merced, California, this question of language, what language do they speak or don't speak, becomes really important. If I'm doing questions about deep civic engagement in a public high school, understanding language and language access becomes really important. If there are monolithic Spanish speakers in the space, if there are folks that have parents that only speak one language, and then they often serve as the translator for a household and they're a teenager, what does that mean? And how do we identify and recognize the needs of these folks? And so I like to invite people when I start talking, and I'm inviting all of you to really think about when I mention community in this presentation, to really challenge yourself to think about, well, who are the communities that I'm a part of? Who are the communities that we really need to think about that need to be at the center of decision making? And I think that's what we're building around. The last question I'll ask y'all to think about is that community that we're talking about, the one that I'm challenging you to think about specifically and deeply. I want you to think about what they need. And I want you to also, this is sometimes harder for folks, to think about what it would look like to invest in your community, or really to let that community choose what the investments they need are. Is your community invested in right now? Are they not? I think as we move through today's presentation, sometimes it is the first radical step to imagine a future where people can make decisions and participate in some self-determination. And so take a moment now, and as we move through this presentation, to really think about what your community needs, not as a barrier, but truly as an opportunity that they can answer. And I want you to invite in some honesty. Do they have what they need now? Are they being invested in? Are they not? What does that look like? So do a little bit of level setting in your mind. And now that I've invited you into some thinking, some grounding, let's talk a little bit about what this whole PB thing is. I say PB a lot because participatory budgeting is quite a few syllables. So hang in there with me, y'all. When I talk about PB or participatory budgeting, I am talking about a democratic process in which community members directly decide how to spend a part of a public budget. It's a nice musical interlude for y'all. But yeah, so PB is an opportunity for community members to directly decide how to spend a part of a public budget. And you might be saying, well, man, that simple sentence sounds pretty simple, but how on earth does that work? How could you engage an entire community or group of people in making a decision? Sometimes it's hard to make a decision in a household, never mind across several different districts. Well, the first thing is it takes time. Participatory budgeting isn't a process that happens overnight, but here are the phases of the general framework of PB. We start with the design phase, where a steering committee of community members, those specific groups that you thought about when you're thinking about community. When I first did my PB experience in Boston and we were designing the process, it was a youth process. So the steering committee was actually community members that came from low-income neighborhoods, traditionally and historically marginalized neighborhoods to be specific. They look like members of the LGBTQIA community. They look like young people that identified as houseless. They look like formerly and currently incarcerated young people. And we were that specific in the composition of the steering committee to make sure that we were designing the process correctly, that those closest to the issues that we thought the process needed to solve would be at the center of the design phase. Once we designed the process, meaning we wrote the rules that govern the process, it was very clear who was eligible at various phases. Then we moved into the brainstorm phase. This is one of my favorites. This is where you collect hundreds, if not thousands of ideas. Often, instead of polling locations, there are idea booths, sometimes games, whatever the steering committee decides and whatever community is able to build together to create a safe environment where folks can put ideas out there, really think about what is needed, what would be helpful, what is working, maybe what is not working. After we collect those hundreds, if not thousands of ideas, we're able to move to the next phase of PB, which is proposal development. This is a little counterintuitive because this is actually my favorite part of the process, but it's maybe the most labor intensive. And I think that's why it's my favorite. I think this is where we see the most gains from individuals in a participatory budgeting process. That moment when community members are sitting alongside agency or city staff, and they have an opportunity to really get deep, vet projects based on need, feasibility, impact on equity, really understand, one, how a city or agency works, but two, for a city or agency to really understand what community is and how community works and what community needs, like understanding those city spending priorities and understanding and marrying that with community spending priorities. I think that's what happens in proposal development when we vet those ideas into concrete proposals. Once those proposals are vetted, we're able to move into the ballot phase. Vetting means that anything that happens or anything that makes it onto the ballot can actually happen. It's been reviewed, it's been permitted, it's been really vetted and understood by the agencies responsible for carrying out the construction in a project or the implementation or delivery of equipment, whatever is eligible in that specific PB process. So nothing makes it onto the ballot unless it's really going to happen out in community. And then we go out and vote. This part is a lot of folks' favorite part of a PB process. It's really not only fun, but I think it's different than local and national elections. And a PB vote, unlike a local and national election where it's often kind of one day, I think that's changing now, PB votes typically span 1 to 2 weeks. And we reduce barriers in a PB vote as much as we possibly can. We really think about the design, whether it needs to be an online vote, whether we need to credential voters in person. I've worked with school systems where they were able to use a student's unique student ID to credential every young person in the city to be able to engage in a PB vote process. I've seen folks sign affidavits or provide some sort of identification or a library card so that they can access a ballot. I've seen folks just sign an affidavit that says, I live, work, or play here to be able to engage in a PB vote. We've seen hundreds of thousands of folks participate in PB votes across the country. And generally, this looks like opening up the ballot and being able to spread a number of votes across the ballot. There are a few different kind of voting mechanisms that I can describe as well, but I think the most popular one or the most likely one that you would see in the United States is an opportunity, like I said, to spread a few votes across the ballot and really vote for several projects that you think would have the highest impact or of the highest need in your community. The winning projects are funded. And then this little loop back arrow means that the whole process is evaluated. And what I love about PB is it's not a one-off effort, but it is an iterative process. It marks a change in the way that government works. It marks a change in the way that organizations do business. And so I mentioned it's something like 10 years new. And I wanted to give you a little bit of a picture of the growth of PB over the last few years. This map at this point is probably a little outdated, but I think it illustrates what it needs to. We're seeing participatory budgeting rise across the country. I want to see more in the middle part of the country, but I think we're seeing some really important growth. And just talking about that growth for a few minutes before I turn it over to you and invite in some of your questions, thoughts, and thinking, I want to tell you about a couple instances of participatory budgeting that really stand out to me. The first one is what happens in what we call the safe schools process in Brooklyn, New York. This is I have a lot of favorite PB processes. So let's just acknowledge that. But this is one of my favorites. In the safe schools process in Brooklyn, New York, what's really cool about this is we're seeing young people, high school students, have an opportunity to reimagine and redefine safety in their school, and then be able to decide not only on about $500,000 of how to keep their campus safer, but also actually be able to design and craft policy at the school that would keep students safer as well. And so what's really interesting about the Brooklyn Safe Schools process is that we're seeing students come together to really think about what allows me to show up to school, to feel comfort, to feel joy, to feel safety, to feel the things that I need to learn. And then how do we make sure that we have them? And in the couple years that we've done this Safe Schools pilot in Brooklyn, I think the projects that have come out of this have been really great. They've included spaces for unity, really to renovate these spaces so that students can come together, foster deeper relationships, build a community of care. And then secondly, they changed policies that just made sense. In some campuses, it would house multiple schools, but they were kept kind of separate from each other, didn't really interact very much. That made students feel unsafe. So instead of doing that, they said, well, let's change these policies that keep schools so separate, and let's make sure that we have an ongoing body of students that come together and regularly do some safety checks, some safety thinking. And so they formed that committee across schools. These are some examples of what's happened as a result of the Safe Schools process in Brooklyn. I have to talk about young people just a little bit more. So shout out to my friends in Boston. This young man on the Boston slide on the left is Stephen LeFew. He's one of the most amazing people that I know. And he actually is the youngest person that serves on our board of directors right now. And at the beginning of this conversation, when my bio was read, there was this reference to all of this amazing work in Boston. And a lot of it was actually spearheaded by these young people here. In the city of Boston, there was this opportunity to really think about, what does it look like to do a citywide participatory budgeting process that focuses on young people between the ages of 12 and 25. And not just young people, but really focuses on young people that experience barriers. And when we rolled out this process, and I mentioned that steering committee effort before, that was essential. And so really getting clear on where young people came from, who was experiencing the most barriers, who was often left out of decision making. That's what we were able to build in the city of Boston. And in the first year that we did PB, we saw something like 2,000 people participate in the process. In the second year, we saw that number move up exponentially as we built deeper relationships and engaged larger systems like the Boston Public School system in the design of the process so that it could be more accessible to young people. In the end, young people made some brilliant decisions on how to spend $1 million and continue to this day. We kicked this process off in 2014. I no longer work for the city of Boston, and they continue to iterate on this really powerful youth participatory budgeting process. It's definitely a way that people think about government in the city of Boston, to the point where now we're looking at even bigger opportunities to do PB that are connected to divesting from systems of harm in the city of Boston and really allowing community to drive investment into solutions that work for them. I want to take a moment to just talk about Phoenix for one more second and really acknowledge that when we think about the redesigning safe schools process generally, or thinking about deeply engaging community and reimagining school safety, Phoenix is like, man, some of my heroes in the work of really speaking to what's possible. In Phoenix, Arizona right now, something really special is happening. And it started from one high school in a district doing PB, moving to 5, spreading across the entire district. And so when about a year ago, folks in Phoenix were really starting to think about what safety meant, as conversations across the country around safety, equity, racism, we're really ratcheting up, and we're thinking about this moment of George Floyd, the death of Breonna Taylor, and so many other Black people. One of the things that Phoenix Union did was say, we think there's a major opportunity here to recognize that what we're doing right now to keep some folks safe is not working. Keeping armed officers at every campus is not making the majority of our students feel safe. It's not making parents feel safe. In many instances, it's not making teachers feel safe. So they're running a $1.2 million participatory budgeting process that allows them to kind of reallocate the funds that were going toward armed officers on campus and really allow students, parents, and teachers to define and decide how that money should be spent to keep them safe across the district in their school environments. And I would say that Phoenix is about halfway through this process, and I can't wait to be able to give folks more updates on what they've decided on, but their vote is coming up in the fall. So stay tuned for that. I want to mention quickly just a couple other case studies before I turn it over to y'all for questions. The first one is Seattle, Washington. And maybe you all have seen some of what's happening in Seattle just on the news generally, but this is another really exciting instance of PB. First of all, the art in this process around this campaign for divest, invest PB, or more equitable PB, or participatory budgeting that recognizes this need to really think about systems of harm and dollars that flow into systems of harm, and how we can ensure that community needs are met by allowing community to decide where those funds go. I think Seattle is a really good instance of a campaign to win that, where they brought together community organizers and agencies with big asks and big demands. And now we're going to see at least a $12 million PB process move forward that I think has the opportunity to be much, much larger. Forgive me, I'm saying there's a $30 million PB process that's going to move forward in Seattle. 12 million of those dollars are actually going to be divested from Seattle PD and reallocated by community. So I think this is one of not only a beautiful process in that the art for this is beautiful. So shout out to the artists. And I think it's going to be one of the most impactful instances of participatory budgeting we've seen thus far in the United States. And so as I start to wind down this presentation, because I really want to get some questions in from you all, I wanted to kind of recognize a couple things. One, we're in this moment of COVID. So you may be thinking, yeah, I kind of get how this works in person. How does it work when we're thinking about social distancing and when we're in this age of COVID? I will say that over the last year and a half, I've noticed a couple things. Communities, cities, districts, agencies, some were able to move forward in their PB process. Some had to pause or alter it. But I would say every group that was doing PB had some real information channels, networks to activate some trust built in community, where they were able to kind of move forward in this moment of COVID differently. I saw that both in New York, but especially in places like Phoenix, Arizona. They've had a couple years journey of building deep relationships, of building trust, of building budget transparency. And so when COVID hit, they were able to activate a different sort of mutual aid network, and they had a different level of trust and engagement from their broader student, parent, and teacher community. And so I think that there's this spillover effect that happens when we do deep engagement, when we do instances like PB, whether it is general programmatic information that we're able to use to improve programming, but also when it kind of fosters the infrastructure to build real relationships so that we can come together in moments of crisis. As I kind of begin to tell you all about my kind of final point, if it wasn't clear already, I think that there's a lot of opportunity when we center community-led decision-making. It creates an opportunity for us to really shift or share decision-making power, to really make sure that those that are closest to the issues and often excluded are actually not only included, but able to shape the reality around them. Ultimately, we're able to generate more equitable and better decisions for everyone. And we're able to make political processes more inclusive and representative of the communities that they take place in. No two PB processes are the same. No two communities are the same. So they shouldn't be. So this is about a customized experience, a customized opportunity for what happens in an agency, a city, a school. And then last but not least, I feel like when I start doing this work or started doing this work in community, and I would mention, do you want to spend $1 million of the city's budget? People were like, I don't believe you. I don't believe that that's possible, because my experience with government so far hasn't shown me that that could be possible. Instead, though, what I find when we do PB processes is that there is a real transformation of the relationship that people have or that they envision having with government institutions or agencies. Harvard University did a study of PB in Boston in that first year, and they found that the participants were more likely to walk in to a city-owned building after engaging PB. They reported that they were more likely to talk to someone that worked in government, that they were more likely to vote in a local and national election, that they were more likely to consider politics themselves or could now see themselves in this larger sphere of systems change. And I think that's what it's all about, creating pathways for different leadership to be recognized. I mentioned that at PBP, it's not just about participatory budgeting, but it also includes systems change on broader levels. We have to think about policy, the policies that mandate participation and the policies that mandate equity, if we're going to think about bigger and broader systems change that everyone can be a part of. And so one of the things that we built was Democracy Beyond Elections, a collaborative campaign or coalition rather, of partners from across the country that I think are going to launch a variety of campaigns. But the one that we're considering now includes spreading this participatory policymaking model, this opportunity for community members to make decisions about the policies that affect them, and that they should really be able to shape the policies that affect their lives. And so I'm really closing out and really going to turn it over to you all for some questions, which I'm very excited about. But I want to maybe close with like this one last question for you as we move into our discussion. And so feel free to share in the chat, feel free to share as you're asking your question, but what is your vision for radically inclusive democracy? How different does it look than what we're doing now? And one of the things that I think about is this quote from Angela Davis that I just love. And what she says is, you have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world. And you have to do it all the time. And I think that's part of the equation that makes change real, possible. It's this something that Marian Kaba says, is that we have to have a discipline of hope. And I think that not only is participatory budgeting an opportunity for us to exercise that muscle, but it's a space for us to really think about what's possible together and then move into action. So I will stop sharing my screen, and I am very excited to hear some questions and to respond to some questions from the people.
Well, excellent. Thank you so much, Shari. And I appreciate the connecting of the dots between physiology and anatomy and just hearing all that you've done. I really love the example of students being able to design schools that felt safe for them, because I just think it's really powerful and meaningful that many students don't feel safe at school. So thank you for that, just sharing the process, but also sharing how it plays out in real life. We do have a number of questions that we're going to start with, and I'll read those to you. Just a reminder, if you're watching on YouTube, please go ahead and put those in the chat there. Dr. Escobar Ratliff will transform those to Zoom, so we'll be able to get to those, and we'll see how many we can get to today then. But our first question is, how long did it take to get buy-in on participatory budgeting? And what would you identify as key strategies to help garner that support?
Well, I know this is not a popular kind of like response, but the answer is it depends. And I think that there are some instances that I've seen securing buy-in for participatory budgeting take weeks, maybe a couple months. There are some instances where I've seen the advocacy, the demand for PB take a couple years. And I think what it depends upon is kind of the political will, some of the conditions that exist in that space, and whether or not it's a bottom-up solution, meaning I've really seen PB not go well when it's mandated from the top, but when it is designed from the bottom out, and that also takes time, I've seen it go really well. I think generally it takes about 6 to 8 months to run a PB process in a full cycle. 6 months is like maybe a little tight. 8 months is probably, you're feeling pretty good. 10 months might be not luxurious, but probably the right way to go. But I think we see that range, that 6 to kind of 10-month range, with most folks kind of fitting in that 8-month category of running a process beginning to end.
Excellent. And so many of the examples you gave, of course, are within local communities, and that's actually how you started. Do you think that participatory budgeting could eventually be extended at a national level as well?
I do. And I think that others do as well. And so right now, one of the things that we're talking about, or that you see in the United States at least, is this hyper local instance of PB, districts, cities, sometimes organizations and agencies. But if you look globally, there are places like Portugal where the entire country does participatory budgeting. If you look at places like Paris, France, where the mayor puts up 5% of her budget to run 3 PB processes, that is one citywide, one district-wide, and one youth-focused, just to give you a sense of kind of what is possible from big city to region to maybe even entire countries. I think here in the United States, as we look at the American Recovery or Reinvestment Plan, I think that there's a major opportunity to consider what it looks like to apply federal dollars to community-led decision-making. We've already seen some of that in Oakland, California, with community members deciding on CDBG, Community Development Block Grant funds. So in short, yes, it's possible. And I think you can join us in making that more possible, or building out what we're calling our Democracy Beyond Elections campaign. I'm just flashing on the screen quickly our Democracy Beyond Elections campaign website, in case people are interested in signing up and getting connected to that, and building some of that national strategy kind of with us. And then I just wanted to mention our Visions for Justice. We have some really cool videos too, if you wanted to get a picture of what some of this work could look like, what we vision it could look like, and inviting you into that vision as well.
I really love that you have the data that demonstrates that people who engage in this also then have further civic engagement, whether it's voting, whether it's in running for government positions, whatever it might be. That's pretty interesting to feel that systemic effect, right? So our next question kind of just follows what you've been discussing. How do you convince government officials then of the need or the benefit for PB?
Well, part of it is I speak their language a little bit. I'm joking, but as a person that worked in government for about 15 years, I think that there are a few strategies that we consider. The first one is honesty. What are you trying to achieve? And I think most elected officials will tell you, I want to be good at my job. Sure. And I think that participatory budgeting is one way that you can come through on that promise. We summarize some of that conversation in a white paper that we're often able to give or distribute to folks that are in elected office to say, hey, we are able to make better decisions together. Here's some data. Here's some data that includes building deeper relationships across broad constituency. This is some data that looks like building pathways for leaders in community to lead alongside you. And so, yes, there are opportunities to talk about recruiting folks for government. There are opportunities to talk about strengthening relationships. But I think it comes down to, what is your legacy of change going to be? Mm-hmm. And how do we build a process or infrastructure to move into that legacy of change? And I find that people make the argument themselves.
I love that. Good. Our next question is that some people have trouble recognizing their innate power and love the empowering nature of PB. Can you talk about strategies to help people own and foster their own power? It sounds like you've done quite a bit of this.
I love this question. Now I know I'm talking to some social workers out there. Okay. Hey, y'all. Good morning. We're here now. I love this question. And one of the best things about community is it is powerful. And I think that so often when we turn to each other and when we see each other, we create this space for a mirror. And I think when I think about these rooms virtually and in person is better. It's kind of like this master reflective space where people are just reflecting on each other, and there are waves of it. And I watch folks kind of leave that room, that space of ideation and iteration different, right? They look supercharged. And so seriously about the innate power, I think that the first part of it is in the same way that we started our conversation today. I just asked y'all to think about some things. I can guarantee you that everyone thought about different things. And I can guarantee you that if we start sharing those things that we talked about, if you all start sharing those things that you talked about with each other, it's not about being right or wrong, but it is about learning. I think that we're smarter together. We can cover each other better together. I think that is powerful. Fostering relationships that are born in transparency, support, honesty is really powerful. I think being able to build muscle for visibility, for safety is really powerful. I think so often we haven't been given license, liberation to be free and safe. And so when we're able to do that for others, to say, hey, I hear you. I disagree with what you said, but I hear what you said. I think that is a powerful moment in and of itself. And I think so often that doesn't exist. And so when we are able to create that and it's broader than lip service, it becomes powerful in and of itself. And so I think recognizing that innate power is really some space for people to be heard, for action to be taken, for acknowledgement to be had, and for good facilitation to be the guide.
Excellent. I'm sure you've been at some very powerful meetings where that just meaning became empowering. Absolutely. The next question is from Denise. It's a little bit of a parallel maybe, but it speaks to that empowerment. She said, a large portion of my project is around police reform, and I've discussed defunding the police as part of her, I think that's her capstone, part of her capstone. What are some of the ways the divested funds are being reallocated in Seattle? You said 12 million was going to be divested from the police department. Have they determined where those are going yet?
Well, the short answer is I don't know, because it hasn't happened yet. But I think like step one is winning the commitment, right? And then step two is moving into a deep process. And what I can say is that there are going to be elements of participatory action research. The design of this is going to be different and on a greater scale than some of the PB that we've seen before. I think that healthcare, broad definitions of health are going to be at the center. I think that there are going to be some real consideration for whether or not funds can go back into police in the same way that we see police now. And so, for example, in Phoenix, something that would be ineligible for the ballot there is additional police officers at schools, right? So this process wouldn't be used to kind of invest in things that have already been identified as harmful. And so I think that we're going to see some of the same elements in Seattle. This is a much bigger process. You have a lot of groups involved. And I think one of the things that makes me most excited is these opportunities for community-driven research and design throughout.
I think that's when it gets overwhelming in terms of talking about time, because that does take time, and it takes patience to be able to fully grasp what the needs are, as well as what threats might be to those needs. Next question is, what would you say to communities who assert that they are doing something similar to PB because they survey their communities about public fund use, but it's not, right? How do you help bring those communities along?
I love this question.
They're tough.
Well, no, I love this because it's like, this is a real thing. So first of all, let me just affirm that this really happens, right? Mm-hmm. Where someone says, we're totally doing PB. And I say, oh my gosh, that's great. Tell me about it. And they said, well, we sent out a survey last month. I said, oh, and then what? and there's usually a little bit of pause, right? And so I don't think I have to tell PB people that it's not participatory budgeting. I think that folks come to that pretty quickly when we start having a conversation. I think the biggest parts of this is that PB is not a one-way conversation. There needs to be collaboration. And by collaboration, I mean community literally needs to make some decisions. And sometimes I find that folks assume that that's going to mean, I don't know, taco trucks falling out the sky, which maybe isn't a bad thing. But what I find in practice is that that's not what people are saying. People are saying incredibly pragmatic things. And I think it's actually being able to give examples beyond what a survey is able to do. Right. That folks are like, oh, and it's bigger than a survey. It involves this dialogue and conversation. The time needed is necessary. It actually strengthens people that work in government. Remember, I'm a person that worked in government. I can tell you that there's not a ton of onboarding. There's not a ton of professional development that happens in that space. And so when we're able to have these conversations together and develop shared understanding, it really works for everyone. You can't get that from a survey. You can't break down and digest the information that has come in from a quick email. It often includes a multimodal approach. And that's what we're talking about when we're discussing PB, that dialogue element, that decision-making element, that multiple touch point element. We're talking about systems change. And so one question that I get is, what is the bare minimum that I have to do for it to be PB? And the question that I ask back is, do you want to make bare minimum impact? And the conversation changes pretty quickly, right? So if I say, do you want to make bare minimum impact? They say, no, I want to make maximum impact in my community. And then I say, all right, well, we can't do the survey. We have to do more than that.
Right. That's a good point in that creative process that you talked about and really illustrated through your graphic. You know, that can't happen in a survey. It takes people coming together.
Exactly.
Good. I know we have just a few minutes left, Shari. I appreciate your patience with multiple questions. Can you maybe talk a little bit about what those first steps would be to bring participatory budgeting to our communities? How can we approach community leaders about advocating for PB?
Keep the questions coming. I'm happy to answer them all. I think the first step is see if there's PB in your community. There may be some PB bubbling somewhere. Okay. Maybe it doesn't have a lot of attention. Maybe there's a fight for it that someone is trying to get other people on board for. So one is check and see if it exists. Two is ask about it. Why doesn't it exist? Where could PB happen? Mm-hmm. And I think part of asking is learning together, learning what the opportunities and options are. I think as it relates to learning, there's a ton of free resources on the Participatory Budgeting Project's website that kind of outline how to win PB, from advocacy to outreach to meeting with elected officials to setting up a process to staffing it. And so I think that information is out there. I think our organization is super down to support people in thinking and crafting and fighting for PB. And now there's also a network of practitioners in the United States and beyond that are doing PB and can really help think through roadblocks. Like I mentioned, no two communities are the same. So I think the first step is to look around and see what's going on. The second step is maybe to learn a little bit more, engage with us and our network of folks so that we can help you build out an opportunity for community-led decision-making. I think a really good way to stay connected to the work is to sign on at democracybeyondelections.org, because I think that's a great space for folks to learn about models like participatory budgeting, participatory policy making. We're going to be launching a democracy coach kind of program where we're hoping to resource folks in their kind of leadership and building community process. So I think that's just another space for folks to look to kind of build some of this stuff out. But the short answer is, you can do it. And I think the first thing you have to do is see what's happening, ask some questions, and then make it happen.
It reminds me of really your first question for us is, how do you define your community? And knowing that your community doesn't have to be the city you live in, it can be a myriad of things, right? So good. One question was, are community forums a positive way for the community to be informed about PB?
I think so. I think a community forum can be a lot of things. I think one strategy that I've seen when we're introducing participatory budgeting to a community is to have a couple of community meetings or events, virtually or in person, where folks can go through and experience a PB process. That process that I talked about today can be a little heady, right? You're like, yeah, I think this sounds good. And I think I get the theory. But what we do is move people through a 45-minute or hour and a half long experience of what PB is, of how to visualize this in your community, what it can mean in your community, the types of conversations that you might have, what it could feel like to build a ballot, what it could feel like to vote on projects in your community, what kind of projects would even come out of this. And so this forum could take the shape of a briefing, like a short presentation, but I also like to see these like immersive experiential learning elements where people can bring their full selves and their lived experience into like learning what PB is and then being able to opt in. So long answer, the shortened version is yes, they can be great. And I like to do them like really, really cool workshops.
Excellent. I like the variety there. Okay, so final question, just to bring us home here. Can we bring it back to you? I think it was maybe one of your TED Talks, or maybe I read this in your bio, but you started working in the mayor's office as a teenager. So you clearly were destined for something, right? With impacting government and supporting citizens of communities. How did you get started in that?
Yeah, I was clearly destined to make trouble. And I think it's funny because the mayor in Boston before I worked for the city used to call me and a lot of other people troublemaker. He said, "Hey, troublemaker." That was like a nickname of mine from the late Mayor Tom Menino, which is just makes me smile. Yeah, how did I get into this? I think the answer is a lot of these communities that I talked about at the beginning, I'm a part of, right? I am a Black, gender non-conforming woman who comes from a low-income family and has experienced a lot of barriers. And one of the things that I really found solace and safety in was community. I grew up as a martial artist. I started training when I was 9 at a community center. And my mom was one of my students by the time I was like 10 or 11. And we were on this sponsored team. And I would travel and compete. And and I think it was there that I really understood what it looked like to build a network of community that really cared for each other, that looked out for each other, that supported each other. And I wanted everyone to have access to that. And they didn't. It was such a unique thing that I had experienced, and I didn't want it to be unique. And I found that when I stepped into government, this was a summer job. I got a 6-week summer job. It wasn't like some ordained thing that I landed in the mayor's office. It was a lottery. And when I got there, I was like, this is a unique thing. And I am a unicorn in this space. And I don't like that. I think that is inappropriate, and this should be an accessible experience for everyone. It shouldn't be that I'm the one that made it in here. And how do we begin to, one, acknowledge that and then change it? And so part of the reason why I'm here, I think Mayor Menino gave me this nickname really well. If there was anything predestined, maybe it was that. It's because I asked those questions. It's because I really wanted to sit not only in conversation, but conversation that moved toward action, whether that was building a team of folks that come from low-income neighborhoods that can really step into their physical and mental power, right? Or whether it was in government, being able to see people that look like you, being able to address the needs of the folks outside of the walls of City Hall, to be able to do that smartly. I was like, there is a major disconnect here. And how do we build pathways for actual community leadership? And I just kept asking that question over and over again. And now, couple years later, right, I'm in my early 30s, I'm asking those questions to communities, agencies, organizations, people young and old across the country. And so that's how I got here. And I'm still asking.
Well, I love it. I love your sense and your vision of community, and I know it's incredibly powerful. I want to say thank you so much for your time this morning. I know multiple students have expressed their thanks too. I'm sorry you can't see those on YouTube, but we're grateful for the time and to hear from you. So thank you so much for that. We do know now that the troublemaker is not an insult by any means, and we look proudly to that day, I guess, when we too can be troublemakers with you. So thank you, Shari, for your time today. We appreciate you joining our 2021 DSW Residency Week and appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for the work that you're doing out there. Social work is incredibly important, near and dear to me as someone that comes from like a public health and healthcare background. So y'all are doing really important things, and keep up the good fight.
All right. Sounds great. Thank you. Take care.